This is the cal.com platform page, which you can find at cal.com/platform. This site has a slightly different visual style from the cal.com main site. So unusually for me, I'm going to be focusing just on this subpage, but I think it's newly released alongside cal.com 4.0, which is probably why it's got a slightly different visual style. I've always liked the cal.com visual style. It's very bold, has a strong color palette of mostly black and whites. And since they've sort of evolved that here or played with it and done some new things, I wanted to go through and explore. The first thing that jumps out is this sort of 3D isometric view of what is actually the cal.com interface. And so I think if you give, normally I'm not a fan of people who take interfaces and sort of skew them and maybe put something like a tilt shift on them. Usually it obscures the interface, makes it harder to see. In this case, they've given it a lot of space. They haven't put a tilt shift effect or anything, so nothing's blurry in the foreground or background. This helps them to show things like elevation, which is quite nice, both here and here. That adds some visual interest. And generally the interface is clear enough, but also this is not really for you to see the interface itself, because that comes later. And you'll be able to see it front on as you would on a screen. This is more for visual interest and to introduce the page. And I think it works quite well for that because, first of all, it does give you a sense of what you're here for. This is very clearly a calendar view. And if you've used scheduling software, you probably recognize this sort of interface anyway. But also it adds visual interest. It draws you in because it's a hero section. And because they've done this isometric approach, you get these very nice lines pulling in towards the center of the page. So it's essentially guiding your attention downwards by using things that are relevant to the product. These could have easily been just abstract shapes, but then it wouldn't have been as relevant to cal.com as a platform, as a product. And so the fact that they've used the interface here gives you that introduction, but also the fact that it's this isometric sort of funnel shape really helps. And it's a nice way here. They've added the cal.com sort of branding or logo as a way to fill in this space, but that's also quite a nice sort of background touch. It makes it even more visually interesting. So as I scroll down, you can see that these two illustrations pull apart, and that could just be again for visual interest, but it also feels quite nice in terms of introducing you to the page, because it's as if two doors are opening, or blast doors are sliding apart and you're able to enter the rest of the page. So that feels appropriate for the interaction, which in this case is scrolling down. So they've continued that, and I assume these are not really difficult to create, but they're probably quite time consuming to create, these isometric, essentially screenshots or illustrations of the product. They've taken what is otherwise a relatively plain interface and they found a way to make it more interesting. So they've set that expectation here, and then they've continued it here as the illustrations for these containers. The fact that these are isometric means that they cut across in a diagonal shape, and hopefully that's obvious, but you can see here they are taking up this sort of diagonal portion of a container. Normally you would take a screenshot and it would be rectilinear, so it would be sort of a rectangle, maybe often taller than it is wide or whatever it happens to be. But that means you're filling these very predictable parts of a container. So it might take up the top half of this container if you just had this screenshot straight on, or the right-hand section. Here you've got this diagonal sort of swipe across the container, and this screenshot is instead taking up a much more visually interesting portion of the container, because you're taking up half the container again with a screenshot, but it's cutting across it diagonally, which is just more visually dynamic in general. So it's a bit more interesting to look at. It draws your eye in more. And that means that they have these sort of interesting areas left over to fill with text. And so you can see here there's this natural bouncing up and down of the text in these containers. Here it's at the top, there it's at the bottom, here it's at the top. And again, that adds some sort of layout variety so you don't get too bored just from looking at this carousel of containers. They've bounced up and down. You can see here actually they're overlapped, and it's quite helpful there that the screenshot is mostly white in the background, because that means the text doesn't lose too much contrast. But yeah, this is a way to have that variety of layout without having to have that sort of more standard horizontal or vertical screenshot in the container. But this also means that because they've committed to cutting off parts of the screenshot, because they've committed to these screenshots being more for illustration than for sort of information, that means that they can take a screenshot that would probably normally take up, this rectangle, and they might want to fit all of that into that space. Here they can put it in this isometric view and essentially cut it off whenever they like. So you can see here this screenshot clearly continues outside of this container. They don't feel the need to show all of that. And actually, with this approach, they're showing probably more of the screenshot than they would have been able to if they'd kept it flat on. So there's some drawbacks here in terms of readability, but there's also some benefits in terms of visual interest, but also you're actually showing more of the interface in each case. I think it would be quite hard to show all of the sort of interface they're showing in this illustration if it was flat on. Down here, so just to remind you, you've got this grey up here and then a white background. Down here, they switched to this dotted background. I don't know at first glance what these dots refer to, if anything. It could just be there purely for visual interest. But it does make me think of the small dots in the calendar interface. And I wonder if they're essentially leaning on that concept of dots as a sort of a visual signifier of calendars and putting those in the background. One thing I've only just noticed is that these are very subtly animated. So these dots are fading in and out, which it's slow and it's subtle. It's a background texture, so it's not really trying to draw your attention, but it does add a lot more variety and visual interest and sort of, I don't want to use the word dynamism because it's a bit too uncommon a word, but it adds more movement to the background in a way that's not going to distract you too much, but it is going to make you feel like this is a bit more interesting, a bit more engaging. You can see here they're cycling through these different styles, and this is a live interface, so you can click around and everything, and they're showing you how this platform lets you control how the interface looks. But I really like that they've included this Windows 95 interface that's coming up, this one. So I suspect that no one in their right mind is going to choose that interface for their website, especially not a big company, because the Windows 95 aesthetic, that sort of grey on grey with strong depth cues, is very old at this point. Obviously, Windows 95 refers to 1995. But so I doubt anyone except maybe someone who's setting up their personal website and wants to reference those older interfaces is going to use that. But I really appreciate they included it because a lot of these are much more sensible examples. And then for them to put in a less sensible example of here's something from the Windows 95 era is quite fun. And you've already got this slightly fun, sort of visually interesting element with the 3D isometric interface screenshots. But to add this fun example here that's a bit more wacky tells me something about the company and makes me sort of respect them more in the sense that they are willing to take those risks and show all of the things you can do, because there's also a good demonstration of the platform and its capabilities. They're saying, we know you probably won't want to make it look like Windows 95, but we offer the functionality so that you could make it look that way. And that's a good demonstration of how extreme you could take it. If they were only showing you interfaces or interface styles that you're more likely to see this year, 2024, they're probably going to be showing you quite similar styles across the board. So this is a good way of showing that variety, but also letting some of that culture of cal.com get into the website. This is a good example of cal.com's generally clean approach to visual style, and I haven't done a video about the main website, so I should probably talk about it here. But they mostly use black and white, and colors are generally used to highlight something or to show off something that would be in color anyway. Here it's an icon, but most of this is black and white, and you can see that the interface is black and white as well. So I think that's partly because they want this sort of white box experience where you can choose how to style it yourself. They don't want to inject too much of their own visual style, if they have one, into the product, because you're going to use it to represent your own visual style. But I quite like how they've carried that visual style of the interface across to the website, and it also makes the website sort of more striking and more engaging in general, because black and white is quite a bold style. And so you can see that here, they're being bold with their colors and their style choices, but they've also got these sort of smaller, more subtle details like the border around this one. So it's a good mix of bold styles with some subtle visual details. I quite like the switch to, I think we already had this grey, up here, but I quite like the switch to grey here so that you can have these sort of plain white containers that will stand out against the background. But that also means that these illustrations can be a lot more subtle. If you've got this white background, you can have these light grey illustrations, which will show up quite well against the white background, but won't distract too much from the text, which here has a much higher contrast because that's the part they want you to read. And I think one trap designers fall into is that they spend so long on these illustrations, they want to make them big and colourful and engaging. And I suspect people spend more time focused on the illustrations than they do on the text that the illustration is supposed to support. And so those illustrations really aren't supporting the text in those cases. Whereas here, the illustrations feel like they're much more of a supporting role because the text has that much more contrast. They've been careful to be a bit more constrained, a bit more subtle with these illustrations. And I think that's supported by the idea they've made the page background grey and the container background white, because that gives you the highest contrast for these fainter colours. I like, again, this approach to isometric style for the illustrations. And you'll notice this is a different kind of illustration from the product ones we saw up here. These are actually screenshots from the app, I assume, and they're taken and they're skewed to give them this isometric perspective. And also they've probably added some visual elements like these 3D effects. Down here, they've continued that isometric perspective, but they've done it with much more abstract, more from scratch illustrations. And so they're actually different style of illustrations, but they've kept the same feel. And that's a nice way of making everything feel coherent, is you take the same concept, but execute it in a different way. So here it's just sort of purely abstract illustration, but done in the same isometric style. I do notice this grid of dots in the background. They're very subtle because they have a low contrast with the grey background, but they make me think of graph paper or blueprints, and that fits with this concept of plug and play components, right? You're putting pieces together. You're most likely to do that in this sort of planning stage, and I think the dotted grid in the background very subtly hints at that planning stage, that blueprint sort of approach to work. And I quite like this black background for the footer. It suits their bold style. It maybe helps you to appreciate that this is the end of the page because this is such a big sort of finale. And the high contrast is great. I think footers are a good way to show off your visual style because there's nothing else below them to distract from. One thing I would say is that they've switched from a white background to a grey background here. This might be the way the website is built, maybe across different pages, and so they've kept this. But actually, because of the hard lines that are created by the black container for the footer, I don't think you need the hard line created by this sort of page separator. We are changing from white to grey. If they kept the white here from this section and then just put in this black container, I think that would have worked fine. Like I say, there might be a reason they've done this, but this divider feels unnecessary when this creates such a strong divide anyway.